Hello everyone, welcome to Or This. I'm back again with the Or This videos, and today is Sunday, January 16th. So the scriptures for January 16th are from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 1 through 11 and John 2 verses 1 through 11. And what I talked about in the sermon today is what I would like to kind of expand upon a little bit. The John text is the story of Jesus turning water into wine. And I talked, just as a brief summary, basically there was no reason that Jesus had to do this miracle. This was certainly not a matter of life and death. Jesus had no role to play in providing food or drink for this couple at this wedding. And yet Jesus not only did this, provided this wine for this family, but as it turned out, when the steward tasted the wine, he went and told the bridegroom that, most people use the best of their wine earlier in the celebration and use the not so good stuff later once people are drunk. But in this case, this was the best wine. And so in what Jesus does, it's just so amazingly wonderful. And as I said in the sermon, it exemplifies the grace upon grace of God that is mentioned at the very beginning of John's Gospel. That there's so much grace and love and good gifts of God that come into human life. And this story certainly exemplifies that in many ways. One of those ways is how I just explained. Jesus had no real reason to provide this for this family, and yet it was the best tasting wine they would had yet. And also, for that matter, they were 6 stone water jars that held 20 or 30 gallons. That's how much wine Jesus made. So it was between 120 and 180 gallons of wine, so that it was a lot. And so this is very telling of the way in which God's grace is poured out upon humanity and given to humanity. And I talked about that idea that there is so much grace. Grace upon grace means there's so much, it's overflowing. And it's not something that needs to be rationed because there's plenty. This past week, I read one of my Facebook friends wrote a post about 2 instances in which she witnessed people in stores basically yelling at the store clerk or the cashier or the person who was trying to help and serve them at a particular store, and how they were just, the person doing this was just completely nasty and negative and horrible towards the worker. And when the Facebook friend who wrote about this on her page, when she got to the person who was yelled at, she kind of made a comment about, it's unfortunate that had to happen, I'm sorry. And the person in both cases said, well, that's not the first time today. Or, yeah, that happened a couple more times earlier today. It seems that it is not an excuse, but people are really stressed out. And there seems to be a lot of tension and anger that is kind of coming out. And I see a lot of posts going around on Facebook telling, kind of advising people, reminding people not to yell at the workers, especially at fast food restaurants, because a lot of places are working short-staffed. If you have to send out reminders about that, it must mean that it's happening an awful lot. It just seems like a very sad situation, because as adults you would think that we would hope that we would have a little bit more self-control, a little bit more understanding of people. But the pandemic has certainly made everything more tense and more stressful, as we have seen over the past, almost 2 years now. So anyway, I thought about that in relation to this idea of this grace upon grace. And, you know, first and foremost, the grace, when we recognize the grace upon grace that God has poured out into our lives, that can certainly be poured out into the lives of others. So it's a good thing to think of finding ways to show grace to the people who do service jobs, who work for probably not a lot of money and take an awful lot of abuse and face a lot of negativity from people. So how can we then pour grace into their lives? But the same thing for the people who are going around being so negative and yelling at others and that kind of thing. They must not have a lot of grace poured into their lives at the moment. Maybe they're feeling kind of empty, and so they too are people who needs the experience of grace. Now, sometimes we think to ourselves when we see people who act like that, and we think, well, I'm not, I don't want to be nice to them. Look how horrible they are. But sometimes those are the people who are struggling because they're not experiencing any grace, because they're kind of having to meet high expectations and being yelled at and that kind of thing elsewhere in their lives. And so that's the way that they act towards others. And so whether it be the person who we see being verbally abused in their everyday work, or whether it's people who just seem to have high pressure, who seem to be reacting to high pressure, stressful situations by acting out. These are definitely people and places where this grace upon grace of God needs to be poured out. And as people who are being reminded this week and every week of that grace of God that God shows to us, we are given that opportunity then to figure out ways to continue to pour out that grace upon grace in the world around us and for those who are desperately in need of it. And as I said in the sermon, there is so much grace upon grace upon grace. There's abundance of God's grace available to humanity. There's no reason why anybody's life should languish without it, because there's plenty to go around. So those are my thoughts after the sermon for this week. It's good to be back with you, and I'll be continuing the Or This videos into this year. So thanks for watching, and God bless.